Okay, my name is Ashley Fairbanks, and I am a Anishinaabe artist and designer of things. I don't know, you can get a lot of different perspectives on my Twitter and Instagram profiles of who I think I am at the moment. Sometimes I say I'm an organizer because I care about some issues in the world, and my people are other people that care about different things, who want to make things happen. My people probably aren't the people that just go home from work and make dinner and watch TV. I mean, although my people do that sometimes, definitely. We'll binge some Netflix, but we're also doing stuff the next day. So yeah.
Well, Ashley, first of all, I just want to say thanks for your time and agreeing to talk to me for this. And I also want to just say I've known you for a little bit of time, and you have been one of those people who has helped me better understand some things that I didn't have access to. So part of me wanting to talk to you was just to extend that to other folks, but also sort of to acknowledge that you've been sort of a person for me who's brought teaching and been invested enough in my growth to give me feedback. And I really appreciate that. What I want to start by just asking is if there is a question or an area of focus that connects to your identity in some way that you feel like you deal with frequently and maybe feel like it's a little bit silly that you're still having to deal with it. Maybe silly is not the right word. It's absurd. I don't know. Yeah.
I think something that comes up for me frequently is dealing with other people's expectations of what it means for me to be a Native woman. I work in a lot of different contexts, both politically and socially, inside and outside of social justice world. And there's just expectations that also frequently come from places where you wouldn't expect them to come from, from within the Native community, from outside of it. And, I've always been kind of a weirdo. And, as a teenager, I was dancing traditional jingle dress and in powwows, and I had hot pink hair.
And that was not the norm.
That was not the norm. It's more normal now to have colored hair, but back then people really looked at you a funny way. My dad, I know my dad loves me so much, but he was definitely at first I don't know if you can do this. I don't know if this is respectful to our traditions.
Yeah.
And I was one of the only kind of alternative people of color I really knew when I was younger. There was one other Native goth kid in town. So I don't know. I'm always encountering those expectations, and I think still pushing back on them and surprising myself sometimes when I come at them differently than I'd expect myself to.
What you're describing to me sounds a little like the experience of being an outsider inside of an outsider group already, a layer of I'm not told I fit here amongst people who have often been told they don't belong to the sort of dominant culture. I wonder if you feel or have felt a desire, have you felt pushed to fit more into what people expect? Or do you feel an obligation to hold on to who you are to demonstrate? How much of your identity do you let be about showing people that their expectations should be more nuanced, or how much are you able to just be a person who exists in the world and not carry that, extra weight?
Yeah, I think it's something that's really evolved for me. I'm half white and half Native, but I never really identified that way for a long time. I just only really grew up with my Native family, besides my mom. And a lot of, I think, mixed kids have that, I don't belong in either world struggle. But, since I just grew up with my Native family, I felt very, secure in my Native identity my whole life. But then, yeah, as a teenager, I got really into, different subculture things. So I was, super goth for a while. I was a juggalo, a fan of the Insane Clown Posse.
I wasn't sure if you would mention that, but you have. So
I've reconciled.
Just know
I've reconciled.
We need to address it at least to some degree. Because to me, what that really actually, I mean, first of all, I'm fascinated. And I am in a much kinder place about the Juggalo culture than I think probably a lot of people are. Because I do believe that some people started a movement based on what they really valued and believed in, and they built a community. I know there's some difficult issues within it, but that's kind of beautiful. At the same time, I know how magnets work, and so that that's absurd to anyone to be like, there's no way to know. Like, and I'm not a scientist. But I actually think the fact that you have gone public with your former Juggalo status adds to the idea that there's not any right way to be any kind of a culture. Like, the fact that you can be grow up a Native person and then be like, hey, also, I'm a Juggalo. Like, well, how dare we think anyone has to be anyone sort of thing? Like, I think it's great, even though I really want to make fun of you.
And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. I can make fun of myself. I've come through it.
Yeah.
I was really entrenched in like some deep hipsterdom for a while, where like it felt like a thing that I couldn't maybe mention as much. But no, I think that like now, you know, as I like transition into my 30s, what I've really been experiencing is realizing when I don't need to push back against expectations. Like, sometimes I just like doing a certain thing, you know, and like I don't have to choose to not like that thing because it's more socially acceptable in whatever like group I'm in, right? You know, maybe I really want to watch Fixer Upper on HGTV. Yeah. You know, that's not a space a lot of my friends are in.
No. And despite the hosts aren't both white, it's a very white show.
It's like pretty much peak whiteness.
Yeah.
Like full Pinterest mom status.
Yeah, in Waco, Texas.
Yeah, hella white. Yeah, but I love the show. It's comforting to me, and I think that's how I really know I'm comfortable with where I'm at with my identity, is that I'm getting more and more comfortable doing those things, like, without irony. Because I really used to need like the cushion of irony, and like some of my friends will attest to you that sometimes I still feel like I need to add that to things, like, oh, like we can go to Chili's and it will be hilarious. Right. But like learning how to operate without that, I think, has been part of my process of growing up.
That living without irony, or being comfortable not needing the irony, really resonates to me, especially as I'm a comedy identifying person. Like, that is how my brain works. That's a term I've been enjoying lately. And not having to frame everything as what a goof this is to protect myself from admitting vulnerably that I just care about stuff, whether or not someone cares about them. I don't know if that's maturity or what that is.
Well, I think that just because of conversations we've had in the past, I also know that a little bit comes out of like a class reaction.
Yeah.
So like as people who have moved out of lower class or working class situations, that's when I've really started to realize kind of what I was doing. Like, I was adding this cushion of irony or talking about like how funny it was that we were doing these things, because they were things I wanted to do because of how I was raised. And I felt uncomfortable engaging with my friends who weren't raised the same way. Like, you know, on those things that they might see as like classless, or like too lowbrow. Yeah, I have this great friend Shania, who is an artist, and we were driving to Standing Rock, and it was so much fun just to like talk with her through these things of like, we're going to eat Larry the Cable Guy pickle chips from the truck stop, and like we also care deeply about like creating contemporary artwork and like talking about environmental justice, and those things don't have to be like mutually exclusive, right? Like, I can enjoy watching a sports game or like going to Mall of America or doing those things, and it doesn't threaten my core identity, like as a person from the city or with, you know, around people who are more of like a middle class status.
This is really weird, but this is reminding me of having a moment that I don't think I ever said aloud to anyone, but now I'm going to, which is when I heard Jenny from the Block. I like was like, I understand this feeling of like, I have better shoes now, but I also like, I grew up on welfare, and I'm still that. Like, I'm still, and like, I don't think I relate to J-Lo generally. Like, that was...
I feel like there might be an angry reaction to what
you think people will hate that? Yeah. And I'd love to,
But you know, those people probably don't have a great class analysis.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to accuse them of being wrong. I'm certain I have gaps about my relationship to understanding Jennifer Lopez.
I'm just imagining you dancing to that song now, and that's totally fine with me.
We can make that happen. You've got a half birthday coming up. I'm willing to put that together for you.
This is the experience I was really looking for.
Good, great. I feel like we've gotten away from something. What?
No, I mean, so I think a lot of things that I thought were Native things ended up being poor people things, right? And
can you think of any specifics? I don't know if that's unfair.
Yeah,
because I know what I think of as poor people things.
No, I think of there's one thing that always comes to my brain, which is hot dog buns. Like, I just didn't know that people like had hot dog buns for like non-fancy occasions. Like, to me, that was something that like was a birthday party thing. And so then I found out, like, I think it was when I was in AmeriCorps after college, I started talking with other people who were people of color, and like you could tell like who had grown up like in poverty or like as a working class person, because like we all could relate about like, oh no, we just use bread. Like we use bread with ketchup on it, and that's a hot dog bun. Yeah. And other people were like, why would you ever
fold it in half?
Sometimes if the bread's a little too stale.
Yeah.
So and just
but
like,
you know, if you microwave it with like a sponge in there, softens it up.
That's a real life pro tip.
Hot tip. Haven't used that in a long time, but and you know not now, always there are fancy buns.
Yeah,
I didn't even know that was a thing.
Like with like sesame seeds and stuff like that. Yeah,
a roll they call them.
Yeah,
potato rolls.
Oh my goodness. How do you, like, I just wonder, like, what it would feel like then to, like, be raising a child and be like, they'll never know. Like, what it's like to just roll a piece of bread around a hot dog.
I really like you're going to try to interview me. That's a nice challenge. Yeah, my 12-year-old has although she has anxiety about money, and so that's curious to me. I just realized when we are buying something, she walks away from that. Like, she doesn't like to be near that moment happening. And I started talking to her about it. She said, money makes her nervous, and buying things makes her nervous, and she gets worried. And then, of course, I was like, great. What part of me that still has that is like doing that to her is the whole thing.
That's funny. I still do that when my mom buys things.
Yeah. Well, and part of it's because my mom, like, I pay my mom's rent. And I think my daughter's exposed to my mom's concern about money that's been forever.
Yeah.
So, like, I haven't really... I've not shaken that aspect of my culture. It's still, it's still in my family, and it's complicated.
I really like stealing your interview. I'm going to take the challenge upon myself.
I will fight back. I'll be only so deferent. But so that idea of you thought Native things, what were Native things, are actually poor people things, I think is really interesting. And I also wonder how many people who don't have a lived experience, either as a Native person or a poor person, also does that. Someone who sees something through, I saw that happen in my one or two Native experiences growing up. I didn't know that was about money, and I thought it was totally about the Native culture. Yeah. Do you feel like that is at play too? Not that you can actually step outside and see that, but
I mean, I wonder like how much that happened from to my friends. Yeah. Because I generally didn't grow up around a lot outside of my family. Grew up around a lot of other Native people, like in my school environment. I got scholarship to go to like fancy school, and so there was a lot of Native kids. That way? Fancy school. And so like there's definitely times that I think people encountered things that might have been that situation, or the other way around, where people thought that it was a poor person thing, but it was like an actual Native thing.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I think even if my dad had $1 million, he'd still fry Spam for breakfast.
Yeah. My dad also did that.
Wait, damn it. Okay, never mind.
He's passed on. Probably because of the fried Spam, now that I think about it. How is that intersection of sort of wealth, like financial wealth, and how you think about yourself as a Native person, how has that grown into this sort of grounded, mature Ashley? Like, how much of it is still at play? Because you do a lot of freelance work, and there's not a lot of stability there. Yeah. And then you do a lot of work that is often deeply connected to your culture, but then also work that it's still there, but it's not on the nose in that way. Mm-hmm. So I both wonder how the money background makes you think about the kind of work you do, just what you'll say yes to. Yeah. And then also if those things are inextricably tied in your brain and your heart as like, when I think about my native self, I think about struggle with money.
I mean, that's definitely true, where it feels to me like sometimes like those identities are so tied up together that like I really don't understand like how upper middle class Native people live.
Have you
like,
met rich Native people?
Oh, definitely.
Like,
yeah. I used to be a blackjack dealer at Mystic Lake,
right.
so I've met quite a few rich Native people. And to me, it just feels like very disconnected from our experience because so much of like contemporary Native identity is also connected to like poverty.
Yeah.
Commodity foods. Not a lot of people, especially in urban areas, have those experiences of commodity foods. But that's like something that feels like very Native to me.
Yeah.
And
under-resourced in general, right? With other kinds of services.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, just like, but when you think about like the food culture, especially like fry bread is like a food that, is thought of as like a very Native food, right? But it comes out of that commodity food need. And then you see like, people like the sous chef who are like in full rejection of that. And to me, it's like, it seems like we're giving up a little bit part of ourselves, even though it's like not traditional. It's not connected to who we are. Like,
right, it's a new tradition.
It's a new tradition. Like, but it's comfort. It's comfort food. So. And
I mean, it's connected to your recent past, even if it's not that ancient past. Like, I imagine there's a lot. That's a common cultural struggle for folks. Like, this is what we've developed in these circumstances.
Yeah. But, well, I think there's a lot of trauma around it too, right? When we're like, oh, look at all these beautiful things that we had that were lost or that were taken from us. We don't have access to these cultural foods. And now once we're able to gain status and get money, we can suddenly afford to buy those cultural foods again. Yeah. Or we can like get outside of our bubble and, or like leave the reservation and find, heritage seeds or different crops that are more expensive. Like even buying wild rice, which is like the staple food of like my people, is incredibly expensive, right? Like if you don't like buy it in bulk in the 2 weeks it's available. Yeah. So it's weird to think about like that, like the access to traditional foods being another class issue, right? Like most people who are Native who live in the city like don't have access to, and there's a little bit of shame around that too, around like, oh, like you don't know real Native foods because you're in like this urban, food desert.
Well, then that really seems to connect to that idea of the right way to be Native.
Yeah.
Like the right understanding of what it is to be Native, which is to either be this like deeply traditional, but also sort of American, like U.S. American, like Last of the Mohicans style thing. Just to pull a, like a thing like. I think that's like a white
You all
person,
can't see the face I'm making at Levi right now.
You can feel it. But that presentation of like, this is everything, like as much as I'm sure folks can reject those ideas, it seems like that bleeds into the perception. And then the modern perception, which is to like disavow a connection to all of that stuff. Like you're forced to do this either or kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a few different like kind of like dominant stereotypes or like archetypal roles, I think, for like Native people, right? Like there's like incredibly traditional people who live on the reservation, and then even on those same reservations there's people who are less connected to their tradition, and usually those are the more poor people, like access
because they can't afford the tradition.
Yeah, they can't afford, honestly, like the time that it takes to engage in those things. So like some of my family like is in that position where like you're really thinking so much about your survival that it's kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs things, where you're like, oh, I don't have time to think about like my language or my culture because I'm like thinking about how I put food on the table tomorrow. Right. And then like in the urban environment, we also have kind of like two dominant places where you have, Native people who are really like deep in the struggle, like living in the projects, whatever, like barely making it frequently, which is like something that's a familiar place for me. But then there's also a lot of Native people in the city who have worked their been either have generational privilege and wealth, or who have moved up class-wise, and then are frequently pretty disconnected like from a lot of the rest of the Native community. So like when I was I went to school at the U for American Indian Studies, and a lot of my professors, it was like, oh, I've never like seen you out in the community. You don't feel like the part of the community I know, right? So, and there's not a lot of space in between all of those different places, it feels like, or people don't see the spaces,
Yeah. Are you someone who can walk do you feel like you can walk in a multitude of those spaces?
I feel like increasingly distant from them for a lot of reasons. Like I've had some kind of traumatic things happen that separated me from my community a little bit. And so that's tough. But I'm feeling more and more able to be back in those spaces. Like for a long time, it was very much the center of my life was like the Native community on and around Franklin Avenue. It's like where I grew up. It's where I worked for a long time out of college. But like in the past 2 years, I've not been in those spaces almost at all. But it's still a weird thing where like I still a weirdo. Like I went to South High and like I didn't fit in with other Native kids. I was a weird goth kid who had like crazy colored hair and wore like mini skirts and metal shirts, like it was not.
Great alliteration. Is that a thing you use? Mini skirts and
I
metal shirts?
know that just came out of my.
You gotta make a line of something.
I've been really I've had a lot of good cleverness this week. I said this thing at bingo the other day. I was calling bingo. And I made the funniest comment, and I can't post it on the internet. I should just say it in this interview.
Sure.
I was.
That stuff usually translates.
Right.
Everyone,
right.
You're in a bingo hall.
I was talking about this is caucus bingo, and I was talking about how you find your polling place, and I said you can go to the Secretary of State's website. Like our Secretary of State, he's a little man with a big caucus finder. I keep laughing at my own joke.
You can't post it online. That has to be spoken. In
right?
text, it dies.
I like it.
Well, and I bet it killed in the room.
It really did.
Because
also, I didn't plan
caucuses.
People thought that I planned it. They thought I was lying. I was like, I did not write that. That just came out of my mouth, and it wasn't funny until I spoke it.
That big caucus came out of your mouth. And that's it.
We were on a topic before here, weren't we?
Yeah. I think I've created space where we can pivot a little because I am actually, you mentioned the caucus, and I'm deeply interested in you as an artist, just as its own thing, and you as a political artist. I know you in both of those contexts. I don't know that I've asked you, but there are times I see your work and I think that's actually making something beautiful, and then I see other things and I see that's actually making something beautiful for a political outcome of some kind. So what I would love to know about, first of all, is just because we've been talking about this idea of poverty and this idea of how you grew up as a Native person. I know for me growing up poor, my idea about art was that I was not welcome there. I was too dumb. And I mostly thought of fine art museums. And I've definitely grown up and I have a much richer understanding of those things. And I think I can actually comprehend, but I've also given myself more knowledge to know how much BS happens in those settings as well. But I want to know for you, how did you evolve as an artist to not feeling like you had to make a certain kind of art and to feel that you could or should or had to make art that served political objectives? Yeah.
Well, I think the first kind of step for me, I was just kind of always called to art. And when I was maybe 10 or 11, I started making these collages with found items where I would take all kinds of different things and I would hot glue them to a board and then I would spray paint them all the same color. And there was something really cool to me about that, how that it all felt uniform now.
Yeah. Disparate things that you created.
Yeah. And then you could
kind of showing it somewhere?
Yeah, in the county fair.
Yeah.
I would submit them to the Ramsey County Fair, and I'd win ribbons.
Nice.
And so it felt cool because I could make this art that cost no money really. My mom would buy me a can of spray paint or whatever, and then submit them and then get recognized for them. And win my big $5 check or whatever.
Yeah, but it's validation.
Yeah, and it felt great. And I had actually my third grade teacher had been he had been a college art professor, but then became an elementary school teacher, in his retirement. And so he did this thing where he basically framed the whole world as art. We did math in a way that was reflective of art. It was just in everything. And then in middle school, I became part of this program called New Voices which was headquartered in the Circle newspaper. And we like learned about photography and, you know, how to design a newspaper and how to create stories. And so that was really critical in like my development. And then in high school, I went to this crazy hippie school where we had no classes and we got to do all of our work through projects. And so I got to do a lot of work too that like centered art as the center of the story, even if the context was something different. So we're talking about like, I wrote like a 20-page paper my freshman year about the social constraints that allowed the Beatles to become popular. Like, why did this terrible music become so famous?
You think I'm going to get in trouble about it?
I mean, they got some good songs, so whatever.
Yeah.
I also hate Radiohead, so come for me, internet. But anyway, and then in high school, I got onto the Walker Arts Center Teen Arts Council. And it was one of my probably more formative experiences. Whit, who is my boss on WACTAC, who worked at the Walker and teen programs, just really made a space for us to feel like we could be totally ourselves within the walls of the Walker. And it's something I kind of can't imagine existed now because of how angry I am at the Walker lately. But like, we like really learned how to process artwork and like how to have conversations and be thoughtful about it and how to talk with artists about their work. So when artists would be in residency at the Walker, we would have opportunities to work and create with them.
And was it, in my experience, artists writ large are less condescending to young people than your typical adults? Not always true, but was that the experience with those artists on large?
Yeah, definitely. And like WACTAC was just a really empowered space because it was like a thing to get on it. Yeah. Like you had to apply, you had to show your work, you had to get interviewed by other teenagers. So it was like this real space of like vulnerability. It wasn't an adult telling you that you were good enough. It was like a council of teenagers deciding that you were a valid member of this thing. And then they really like allowed us to create programming that was what we wanted to do. Yeah. And so there was something as a teenager when adults are like, we think you have good ideas and we're going to give you money to execute them. And that was it was a powerful thing. And then some of the years when I was in high school were when they were remodeling the Walker. So we had to like go out in the community and make art and like learn how to talk about the work with people of all different kinds of backgrounds. So like we did a project where we built 10,000 1-watt radios with these artists, Alora and Casadilla, and really learned how to talk about like, we're making artwork that like this little radio that we're building is something for you to make things with, but it's also part of like this like decentralizing power from Clear Channel. Yeah. But then the artwork itself actually was valid too, right? Like people were making like skateboard radios, and like I made one in a jewelry box that was like a secret radio. And it kind of taught me, especially like Alora and Casadilla's work is such an influence on me. They do work that it's like aesthetic, but then it's also powerfully political. Like they had this piece in the Tate Modern in London that was like this like big tangle of metal that like for an hour, like for a brief moment a day or whatever, the International Space Station would go overhead and you could talk with the astronaut. Like you could go into like their radio channel.
Just for that window.
Yeah. Or they did this project where they had a stoplight in Puerto Rico that was connected to this gallery in New York, and the lights in the gallery would change colors with the stoplight. And so like you'd see how people changed motions and different color lighting. But then the project that they did that influenced me the most, they made these tiny chalk statuettes of Christopher Columbus, and then they handed them out to history teachers on the island. And as they taught like the actual indigenous history of Puerto Rico, they like eroded these statues of Christopher Columbus. Yeah. And so it's stuff like that where it's like the work is really in the story. Yeah. That became kind of that huge framework for me of like, this is the work I want to create. But then because like I came from a very financially unstable home, I never saw art as something I could actually pursue as a career. It still seemed like really frivolous, and I had a lot of anxiety about like how I would make money. And so like my plan was still like to go to college and then go to law school. And I didn't come into like really making artwork again until I was in my 20s after college, and like just feeling called to do it. And my first job out of college, I was designing museum exhibitions, and that like design aspect kind of gave me enough of a taste of like making art again that I was like, I need like this tactile thing. It's a way I process the world around me, right? And now I think that it's funny that you divide like artist versus political artist, because to me, like I think this is just from growing up in art at the Walker, like all art is political.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it's what I'm trying to articulate is the intention. Some artists don't take that into consideration. I feel like I'm late in the understanding of like everything that I make as a creative person is saying something. Yeah. And if I don't decide what it's saying, then someone with power will.
Yeah. Well, and like I do design work that is separate from my art, and like so that to me like isn't involved in that like same political component, right? That's like how I pay my bills. But like I did an installation on Franklin where I went to every reservation in Minnesota, and actually Springboard financed this project. I went to every reservation in Minnesota and gathered dirt, like a big Tupperware container full of dirt, and then people could come and like walk in the dirt from the reservations, and like that project is, to me, like an example of what I'm talking about. Like, people look at that and they don't maybe see Native artwork.
Like, even though it was so deeply Native. Like,
and to me, it's like that's the kind of work I want to do, where it's like you have to have the story of it to make sense of it, and you have to like understand like it's a project about sovereignty, right? About the right to our own land. About the fact that like most Native people who live in the city don't get regular opportunities to travel to their homelands. And the theme of that whole project was homeland. And like the reservation I'm from isn't a real it's like not a real place where people are from. It was created by the government, and people were relocated there. But like my family came from farther north towards Canada and from Lake Superior. And so to me it was like this idea of like, even within these reservations, right, that land is just a taste of what our actual land is. Like we actually have had, so much more that we were removed from.
When I got to experience that piece of work, and you were put the soil back on top of the road, which was so concrete a way of this was land that was paved over and taken, and it was just momentarily reclaiming that land.
Yeah.
So, like, that to me was such a tactile way to do art that was really letting you experience something. You said something that just sort of struck me just now when you said, where I'm from is not really a place that people are from. And I knew what you mean, but I also think there's something really powerful in that statement that I think a lot of people don't have words, but it articulates a feeling I think people have of no homeland. I just wanted to call that out because that.
Yeah, I think there's really something interesting for me because like I do feel like I have a homeland. Like when I am on the shores of Lake Superior, I feel like deeply connected to that body of water, which is like Ojibwe people surround Lake Superior. Like we're on all sides of it basically, and like our like spiritual homes are all like connected to like that body of water, and so it's like it's for me I can feel it when I'm there, versus when I go to my reservation, which like I'm told by the government, right, is like my homeland. I don't feel that same thing because, like I said, it's not where we're from. Like this is also like a very different environment so I'm from White Earth, which is mostly prairie and farmland, versus like Ojibwe people are woodland people. We're from mostly like forests, woodlands, and so it's interesting to me how I process that and feel it in my body. Like,
well, and you're talking about where you were put, versus I think a lot of people who come from immigrants, and I'm talking about like my people, we are referring to where we ended up, and that to me seems like one of those big disconnects people have when they are not creating mental space to understand what it really means to say all of this is native land. It wasn't, I get you came here, so it's not really where, but that's not the same thing as, I was somewhere and it was taken away. Like that, it seems so obvious, but there's some weird misunderstanding there.
And it's like, people are just getting comfortable with acknowledging native land, right? But like, I think what you're saying is right, like, they're not fully there yet, and like the actual concept of that. And then the work I want to create next, honestly, and what I've been doing in the past year has been really like thinking about how unfamiliar people are with the original geography of this place. Like, even the things that we think are natural and beautiful aren't. You know, like Pike Island, which is, you know, like Bedote, the site of Dakota creation, like that does not look like how it looked 200 years ago. You know, it was redug by the Army Corps of Engineers. Or like the fall at St. Anthony, you know, there's the horseshoe apron that was built into that. So like we don't see the natural landscape.
Yeah, it's a straight line. And
yeah, like that was all constructed, right?
Yeah.
The falls did not look like that. They were much bigger, much wider. And then they dug those channels to reroute the water.
Right.
Or, you know, like up by my reservation, you know, when you have like the headwaters of the Mississippi, you know, you have a lot of man-made channels that are created like for tourists and things like that. And so there's really something powerful to me about how we alter the landscape and like who decides what's invasive and what natural looks like.
Yeah.
And how that is also like erasure of indigenous landscape, right? Like, so the fact that a lot of the trees that we have in Minneapolis, and we talk like really preciously about our tree canopy as a city, but most of those trees are non-indigenous.
Yeah.
Like they're not, they weren't here originally, that this was mostly tall grass prairie, you know, and people can't, they just don't think about that. They think that this was like forest that was clear cut or something like that.
Yeah.
But we have more trees here now than there would have been, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I want to do, is like create more work talking about how we've even shaped what's known now as indigenous.
Right. And our I'm going to say white people's willingness and current capacity to think back in time doesn't go back very far. Like the whole concept of like, this is way before your time doesn't mean like 200 years ago.
Yeah.
It means way before, like you're just not, it's a matter of scale that is different.
No, so when I used to work at Fort Snelling, I was a costumed interpreter. I dressed like I was from the 1827 every day. I played a fur trade wife most days, and I would ask every visitor who entered the building, like, my very first question, how long do you think Dakota people have lived here? And, like, the average response was anywhere from 400 to 800 years, right? And there's an archaeological record of, like, Mississippian people on this land for at least 15,000 years. So it's like, what does that mean that people are like, oh, Dakota people have obviously been here for 800, you know?
Yeah. And that feels like a long time ago.
Yeah.
Like, I think we have some math challenges.
Well, and I think it's an easier way to deal with dispossession.
Yeah.
Like, I made these stencils for this show at Public Functionary, and one of them said this thing that was so powerful to me, which is like, there's been 25 generations on the land since colonization, and we know about 500 before that.
Yeah.
Like, and that way of quantifying it just seems so important to me, of like, and I think it's harder to reconcile as white people that you've dispossessed people and robbed people of a land that they had for so long, that they have such deep connections to. And it's just hard to deal with the scale of that.
Well, if you really try to take that in, you just feel bad. And white people, we don't want to feel bad because it doesn't feel good. That's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I've mostly been comfortable, so this is no fair.
Yeah. Well, and like, I think when you talk about like Bede Makaska, like, people are there's so many people who are so angry. Yeah. And it's just like understanding how the brief amount of time it's been called that, right?
Yeah.
And how long it was called other names in Dakota before.
Yeah.
Like,
there's no way for me to do this without it seeming terrible. And I still will, because I am still who I am. When people get like a new pet and it's like 8 years old and they're like, you know what? This dog's name is Daisy now. And then they're like mad that the dog is like, no, I don't understand the thing where people aren't like, just will disregard a history of a thing because they it didn't feel right in this chain. Like, it's a weird, and we just do it in tiny ways all the time, and then often these giant ways. Because that, to me, we're only going to continue to understand on a large scale and return a lot of at least the vocabulary. Like I only see this as the start of something much more.
Yeah.
Which makes it very odd to me to see people really fighting against it so much, because I think it is, if you allow for this sort of acknowledgement that name was wrong, that was on there, then you have to acknowledge I've been doing the wrong thing for a long, long time. And so I'd rather just be awful right now than really realize how awful I've been a part of for how long. Like, it's a weird, like, I want to do bad, because if I don't do this little bad, I will have to see how much awful has happened. It's a strange thing that I don't... if you could just fix that, that'd be great. You've carried enough burden, right?
I just think since in Minnesota, we don't have a long history of whiteness, right? It's actually just not that long. No. Most of the oldest things the oldest building in our state was built in 1820. That's crazy. That's like so short ago compared to most of the world, right? Yeah. But people are really invested in that very short amount of history. And I always when you talk about changing the name of a lake or changing the name of a road, you're like, what are you really asking white people to sacrifice? Right. It's not going to hurt anyone. Right.
But it'll be harder to give direction.
And it's really just fighting to maintain white supremacy, right? Yeah. And I think people just aren't willing to recognize that their natural instinct is to protect the status quo. Yeah. And that even simple things, I think about historic preservation councils. We're super invested in making sure that a house from 1902 has the same shutters that it would have had when it was originally built, but yet we destroy, sacred Dakota sites. Right. And it's just being that thoroughly invested in something, you're like, oh, it has to be deeply connected to how people are identifying. Right. And I think that's it, right? This story that we're all kind of baptized in as Americans is this American dream narrative. Yeah. And it has so many things that if you take away some of those other pieces, I think people think the whole thing crumbles. Right?
If it crumbles, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
That's also what they think. Because I'm not necessarily against the idea of the whole thing crumbling either if we can't make a lot of changes. Well, I want to be cognizant of your time. So maybe towards the end of this thing, because there's so many I still really like. I really just want to do a podcast where we just talk about your Juggalo experiences for hours and hours. What I would love to touch on, there's two things. One, I'd love to get from you some practical ideas about ways people can do their own work to understand some of the stuff we've talked about. And also, a question I try to ask everyone is, what are some ways where you feel like you experience privilege, and what does that look like in your life?
Yeah, I can answer that one first. I think that, to me, the greatest privilege I have had has been educational, which is rooted in... So, my dad is Native and from Phillips, and my mom is white and from St. Louis Park, and grew up in a pretty upper-middle-class family, but was, distanced from that family as a teenager, cast out of that family. But she grew up with a lot of financial privilege. And because of that, she learned how to navigate systems. Mm-hmm. So even though we were we were poor and not always very stable, she knew how to get me into a good school and how to get me into all of the free summer camp programs. And
that's so amazing, because that is such for me, as a poor person, I did not know how to access these supposed resources this is here to help all these poor people.
Well, and this is the biggest part about privilege, right? Is telling you that you're worthy. Yeah. And it's you're told that every day from the time you're born. Mm-hmm. And you're either told that or you're not. And it's hard to teach that to people. It's hard to, when I have other friends who grew up in poverty, and you're oh, we can go to the Galleria. Mm. And we can go to the Barnes & Noble there because the clerks are much nicer than they are at any of the other places. Yeah,
I always feel weird at the gallery.
And it's because it's about that privilege of being told our whole life of where we're meant. Yeah, where we're meant to be. And so I feel like being able to garner that from my educational experience, so I went to St. Paul Academy, and it was really drilled into my head that I was smart and I was worthy. and that my culture was amazing. Like, we'd have like these international days, and like, because a lot of international kids go there, but like they would invite my dad to like come make Indian tacos, and all the parents would be like, "Oh my god, this is so good," and like eat piece after piece of fry bread. And so I think that there's something about that where it was like I was given this gift of being told that I was worth it, and that makes me feel like I'm able to fight for a spot at the table because I know I deserve it, and I'm able to code switch really well. You know, I can speak like this and be taken seriously by people in power. And a lot of people like don't have that opportunity. They don't learn like how to fit in amongst a crowd of rich people, you know, which was easy to learn when I was a child and like my friends had nannies and lived in houses with tennis courts, you know?
Yeah.
And also just like the fact that like my mom is like transparently white, like hella white. And I inherited most of her skin color. Like, my dad is, like, a pretty, like, dark-skinned native dude, and I'm pretty light-skinned. And I feel, like, that's been, you know, a privilege I've been told I have my whole life, and that I experienced directly because I would see how people treated my dad versus how they treated my mom. And so it was, like, a life of contrast of, like, being like, oh, when I'm with dad, like, we have to act this way, and we have to, like, be quiet in spaces, and we have to, because my parents are divorced, so, like, my dad would, like, take me to Mall of America, and it was, like, a very different experience than going somewhere with my mom. But then I would also get the experiences of, like, my mom worked in fluid power in hydraulics, and so she'd work on a lot of, like, heavy machinery. So I'd also see how my mom was treated when she was dressed in, like, a sweater set from Talbot's, you know, and then versus like when she was like in her coveralls and people wouldn't serve us, you know, like because she was dirty. Like, so I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of privilege I got out of that contrasting experience, and that I walk through the world with that, right? That I can very easily cover up like who I am, and I mean I keep on getting more tattoos, so it keeps getting harder. but like I can speak in a nice voice and like wear a nice outfit and walk pretty easily through the world.
Yeah. Well, externally. I mean, internally, there's work there, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I don't struggle at all when I go to the Galleria.
Yeah.
I don't struggle at all when I'm in the governor's mansion because I know how to operate in spaces of power.
You know you're worthwhile in those spaces.
And I know that I'm probably smarter than a lot of those people.
Weird that you're always telling them you know I'm smarter than you, right? I just asked if you needed any help.
No, I mean, like, I think learning how to operate around power is just, there's nothing that could have been more of a helpful gift for me in the work I want to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge barrier for so many people is like being like, oh, okay, well, I want to create change, but like I go to this space and I instantly feel like I shouldn't talk because I was never told it was worth, like I could be in that space, right? Versus I got to be this little kid, like, playing in houses on Summit Avenue. Yeah. Like, going and sitting in a box seat at the Timberwolves game or, like, going to the children's theater, you know? And I don't know. It's so that's where I feel like my greatest privilege is like, feeling like I'm just as worthy as anyone else.
Yeah. Well, if people want to better understand the history of this place, because we talked about that a lot, and thinking in terms of, 15,000 years versus 800. Do you have suggestions of online or books? And then the other thing I'll ask is, I feel like a lot of folks who listen to this want to engage in movement work and injustice work, but often are unsure of what that means for them. So if you have thoughts about what can help somebody feel more prepared to engage in that way, I welcome both or either of those kind of areas of focus.
I think the most helpful books that are also the most challenging are to read any like work by Waziatawin. So like one of her books, What Does Justice Look Like? Really talks about like what it means to be living on Dakota land. There's actually the last 3 pages of the book are like just for white people, like to read is like, what do you want? What if you want to change this? What does that mean? And
so that answers both of my questions. Really, just read those too at the end.
I mean, we're pretty far apart politically on what we think the solution is.
Sure.
Like she's like just not okay with people living here.
Yeah.
I
get that.
Like and like as much as I want to say like I recognize impermanence, I also don't see people moving very soon.
Right.
So I'm like, what do we do in our lifetimes? And I think that the most powerful thing any white person can do is transfer wealth. You know, to do your own self-work, to read the books or whatever, but then figure out what are you doing to dispossess yourself of the wealth that you have that was stolen from poor people and people of color.
And how do we reach you on PayPal or the Cash App?
It's cash.me/$Ashley Fairbanks.
It's a great way to directly transfer wealth.
But like,
I know you're talking in other ways too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's something where it's like, you know, I'm a consultant. I can charge people a lot of money and I still don't have any wealth. Like, I don't. My family doesn't have it to give to me. I'm in student debt. I have a car loan. And it's like really recognizing that you started so far in advance of so many other people. It's like even poor white people. I mean,
yeah,
like there's, and I think that's hard. It's harder for people to reconcile, like, because there's still so much struggle. But like, it's crazy for me to think about how much privilege being with my partner gives me.
Like your partner's a white person.
Yeah, my partner's a white cis man who like grew up in Bryn Mawr, which is like a nice neighborhood. You
can tell because they use a Y for one of their vowels.
Yeah. And they have those hedges that say Bryn Mawr when you.
If your hedges say where you are, probably some wealth at play.
And you know, he inherited our house, and like if that was not my situation, I would not be able to do any of the things I do in the world.
Right.
Like, before we dated, I lived in like a shitty building on Powderhorn, which, I mean, I had a really cute apartment, but like also maybe bed bugs.
But you made those bed bugs work.
I did. They really matched.
You knew how to tie it all together.
Yeah, it all went together. The Pinterest bed bugs. You know, and so it's like, I think there's so many things that white people don't consider wealth that are. And sometimes like, I'm shocked by how clueless people are about those things. Like, one time, one of my friends was like doing like a GoFundMe because her car had broke down and she didn't have the money to raise it. And some of my like best white friends were like, well, why doesn't she just put it on her credit card? And I was like, because she doesn't have a credit card. And then like, I was like, we've been friends for like 10 years. How do you not know? Yeah. And I just realized like how little we talk about like the finances and things like that. Like, that my friends had no idea that like I would also be totally screwed if I was in the same position. That like I can't really just like go to my parents and ask them to give me $1,000 to fix my car, and that I don't have a credit card that has a high enough limit to do any of those things. Right. And so I think that a lot of people look at their situation and they're like, oh, I'm not in the position. I'm not the person that has to give back wealth. Right. But it's like, well, if you have 2 cars and you own a house, yes, you are. You are the person. Right. Congratulations. Yeah. You know, and even if it's little ways, you know, if you find like, God, there's so many kids right now who are at the U who are people of color who are really struggling. Like, I think back to college and there was weeks when I made choices like, do I buy the course packet I need or do I buy food? And, you know, I've helped 2 girls in the past year raise money to like survive the U, right? So if you're in that situation where like you live in a nice apartment and you have a car, give $50 a month to some like poor brown kid so they can buy some groceries, you know? Like, it doesn't have to go to a charity, like it doesn't have to go to a nonprofit. Right. You know, make those connections, build relationships with people and say, oh, like, hey Ashley, I'll pay for your student loans.
For example. Your hypotheticals are so clear and understandable.
Yeah, I mean, and so I mean, people, I think that's the biggest thing is like, we try to make this really complicated. Like, how do I do this work as a white person? It's like, just do it. Like, go out to, and like
Nike said.
Just do it, right? We probably stole that from a person of color.
Probably.
Anyway, like, go
they
to
didn't steal it. They paid them less than they deserved.
You know, like, hire us, buy our artwork. I don't know, pay to come to our concerts. Like, it just has to, it's so simple, you know? Yeah. And I think doing the foundational work of, like, having the base vocabulary, that's, like, that part takes a few months. And the rest of it's just, like, the rest of your life. How are you going to figure out, like, when you die, don't give your house to your kid who already started out with a $200,000 loan from you. Like, give it to, like, an organization. Give it back to Native people. Yeah. Like, if your parents die, up north Minnesota, like, gift that back to a tribe. Like, that was their land, you know, let them put it in trust. There's so many different things, you know, so I think that's the thing, is just like looking at your daily life and interrogating, where could I be sacrificing a little? Because there is no white person in this country who has $1 that didn't come partially from people of color.
Where, you already shared where people can give you money directly. Would you guide anyone to see your work, to try to book services with you? Is there a good spot to do that?
Yes, I have a website. It's zibing.com. So it's ZIIBIING.com. And you can go there and see my work, or you can add me on Facebook, follow me on Facebook, and read my daily observations about the world.
Ashley, thank you so much for your time and your openness.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Ashley Fairbanks. I hope you got something out of it. I know I did. I'm really lucky to know Ashley and to be able to share community with her, and I appreciate her giving me her time. I also want to say thank you to everyone else who has supported this show and supported me in my work in justice and art and growth. It's not over. It keeps going. I keep growing, and I hope you keep growing as well. If you have a second, you can rate and review the show on iTunes. That really helps people know about it, and that is what I'm asking for. I want more folks to know about this show, because I hope it can help folks move into action. And I hope you're taking action already, or finding ways to take action. We have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of capabilities to do it. So let's get to it. The theme song for Not About You is by Charlie Van Stee. You can look Charlie Van Stee up on the internet, find lots of great stuff from him. I'm going to end today on a quote. Bertolt Brecht said, "Art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it."